AG recently has come out with several small fillers that are published and released in these cute small baggies. They are inspired by Love Letter, clearly, and it's a pretty understandable attempt to ride the wave of popularity created by Love Letter. Lost Legacy Flying Guard and Lost Legacy The Starship are two such games, and they're very close related to Love Letter. Cypher is another game that kind of falls in the same philosophy. You can see the family resemblance that this game has with the other ones that I just mentioned. Nevertheless, this game is much more of its own thing. This game has similarities with Love Letter and Lost Legacy, but you can see interesting differences. It is more loosely based on the system behind Love Letter. Cypher, the similarities are, well, in the package to start with. The similarities are in the fact that this is a game with a small deck of cards. The cards that you see here are all the cards that are used in the game. It is a game where players have small hands of cards that they can play with each turn. Yet, as you will see in a second, there definitely are some new ideas here, some interesting twists. The game comes with a small rulebook that does a pretty good job of explaining the new concepts and the new rules. Player 8's a player aid per turn, and then a deck of 19 character cards. When you think that Love Letter in this game here is 16 cards, this is almost a monster game. These cards represent characters that will be fighting for power in a dark sci-fi cyberpunk world, full of hackers, technomancers, greedy corporate executives, all sort of characters. Each character has important elements on his or her own card, not just the illustration and the name, but also a dot here, which may be multiple dots, and that tells you about the rarity of the card. A single dot means that that's a unique character. 3 dots, there are 3 copies of that card. 2 dots, 2 copies. Then you have the influence value of the card, which pretty much also means victory points. At the end of the game, the player who has the most points in his player area is the winner of the game. Characters also have an effect that is implemented when the card is played in the play area of a player. And then there are these icons here. There's an icon here which tells you about the class of the character. Characters can be low class, middle class, or high class. So how does the game work? You shuffle all the cards together in a single deck, then you decide who the starting player is going to be, and you deal 3 cards to that player. Then you deal a single card to the player to the right of the first player, and 2 cards to every other player. I know this is unusual, but it's necessary because some of the mechanics in the game are indeed pretty unusual. So you're the first player, you have 3 cards in your hand. The first thing that you do is you play a card from your hand and you resolve the effect. Play it in your play area, resolve the effect. Done. At that point, you draw a card from the deck, so you're back to having a hand of 3 cards in your hand, and you think, hooray, that's great, 3 cards, a lot of choices for my next turn. Not so easy. Because before the game goes to the next player, you have to pass a card to the left player and a card to the right player. Yes, your beloved cards, you have to give them to other players. So usually that will leave you with a single card in your hand. There may be game effects that give you extra cards in your hand. At that point, you still discard down to 1 card. So you will end your turn always with 1 card in your hand, and then before the game goes back to you, other players will give you cards, because it will go through the same procedure, and so you will always start your turn with a hand of 3 cards, and end it with a hand of 1. With cards going around during the game. Sometimes it will be cards that nobody wants or nobody wants to play, such as the Cipher anomaly. This is one that goes around a lot. Other times it may be good cards that you would rather prefer not to give to other players, but hey, you have several good cards in your hand and you cannot keep them all. So you have to decide which card will be less troublesome for you to give, and maybe actually you're setting up traps. You're giving a card to somebody looking all sad because it's a great card, but actually that is a card that you want the player to have because the card you still have in your hand will then interact with that card, giving you advantages. You can be pretty tricky when it gets to that. And maybe the other player is seeing through your scheme and the other player is setting up a counterattack that will turn things to his advantage. As you can see, the general idea is kind of love letter-ish. You play a card and your turn is over, but there are these cards going around the table that add a complete different dimension. Also, this is not a game of deduction in which you're trying to figure out who has what, or you're trying to figure out, trying to end the game with a single super awesome card in your hand. You're simply trying to build up strength in your area. Because at the end of the game, the winner is determined by counting victory points, and those are based on the influence points that the players have. The end of the game may be triggered in one of two ways. The Cypher anomaly card is played, and that triggers the end of the game. Or another way in which the end of the game may be triggered is if the discard pile is exhausted, then at that point the end of the game is triggered. It doesn't happen yet. That means that one of the two trigger conditions apply. All players, including the player that triggered that condition, get an extra turn, get a last turn. At the end of that last turn, you determine the winner by counting victory points. Now, I like the general idea, but to see if the idea works or not, you need to have good cards. The strength of the game really is in the card effects. And as you can see, there are many more unique cards in this game that you have, for example, in Lost Legacy, where you have a lot of duplicates of the same card. Yeah, only some cards have duplicates, but there are a lot of single ones. That means also that the effects are many. And it may take you maybe a game or two more than you would have in Love Letter or in Lost Legacy to become familiar with all of the possible effects. Let me just give you a quick overview of those effects. The Fixer, one of the low-class characters, when played, you draw one card and then you add one card from your hand to your play area, so you can manipulate the cards that you got a little bit. When you play the Extractor, you draw 3 cards, then you choose one card from your hand, then you remove it from the game permanently face down. The Hacker allows you to draw cards from the bottom of the deck. I have no idea what the advantage in that may be. And we played the game and we were thinking. We couldn't figure out a solution. If you can figure it out, just let me know. Just write it in the comments of this video. I'll be thankful. Bodyguard. While in play, you may discard Bodyguard to ignore another player's card effects. So the Bodyguard literally sacrifices himself to protect more valuable characters that you may have in your area and that somebody's trying to steal from you. Then, instead of giving the valuable card to another player, you lose the Bodyguard. Less than ideal, but better than losing a more valuable character. Syndicate Chief. While in play, if Syndicate Chief is in a play area with lower class cards, its value is increased by 3. So it gets more powerful if he's working with cards that are less valuable than himself. Data Runner. While in play, ignore the effect of another player's Technomancers, and so it's a very specific defender, but he can defend against the Technomancers, which can be pretty annoying people. When played, all other players must discard all upper class cards from their play area. This is the great revolutionary. This is the guy that attacks the 1% of the world of Cipher. And if you are planning to use these characters, well, maybe you want to keep them in your hand until some of the dangerous people have been played, or you may want to have somebody that protects you against those attacks. Archivist, oh, this is a fun one. When played, you add the coder from another player's area or display to your play area. Yes, there's also an area which is called the display, in which cards may go and they can be taken from there. Who or what is coder? It's simply this card, which is a pretty valuable card in terms of points. So if a player plays this card and the player is all happy, and there are no defenses such as bodyguards, another player plays Archivist, and that player steals coder from the owner. As we're looking at coder, while coder is in play, you may draw 2 more cards when you're drawing cards. Pretty powerful card, but again, fairly easy to steal if you're not careful. Android has no effect, but it's still 5 solid victory points at the end of the game. Executive, when played, you switch positions with Corp Overseer. Corp Overseer is this guy here, which is worth a ton of points. If you play it, then you switch positions. So that means that you get to steal this guy from another player's area. You're still giving them a decent card, actually a better than average card, but you're taking one of the best cards of the game from them. Corp Overseers, as we were talking about it, when played, discard all lower class cards from your play area. This guy doesn't like the small folks. He doesn't like people from lower classes. Interesting character with a slightly different spin than the Corp Overseer is the Aristocrat, which is also worth a ton of points. And when played, discard all middle class cards from your play area while in play. She can't tolerate the bourgeoisie, the middle class. In aristocrat fashion, she likes the aristocrats of the upper classes. She likes poor people from the lower classes that can be her servants, but la bourgeoisie, no, she can't deal with that, freaks her out. While in play, if you play a middle class card, she leaves you because she can't tolerate the presence of the middle class, and so you have to discard her. The Cipher Anomaly, pretty much what the Cipher Anomaly does is to kill the game. First, it cannot be played if you do not have any other characters in your play area, so you cannot play it early in the game. But when played, you draw one card, then add it to your play area or discard it, and that's good. But problem is, it also triggers the end of the game. And there are two Cipher Anomalies floating around in the system where these players, these characters here, are fighting for power, for control, and for influence. This is a solid and enjoyable filler. A game will only last around 10 minutes, probably a little bit less, maybe a little longer at the beginning, maybe a little over 10 minutes. As the players are becoming familiar with the effects, there are many more effects to learn about in this game than during Love Letters or Lost Legacy. And you also need to become familiar with the implications, what the effects do and what they mean for you. Once players are familiar with that, the game goes very fast. And yet the game has more meat than a Love Letter or Lost Legacy. There are more decisions to make. The fact that you continuously have to give cards to the other players, you cannot retain all those excellent juicy cards that you get in your hand, and you have to minimize the damage from sharing resources. That is great. It appears to be adding an element of randomness to the game because you keep receiving cards from other players and you cannot control that. Nevertheless, that is not the true random element. The random element is only in the drawing of the cards from the deck. The cards that you receive are still the result of a decision made by the players. It is still something that can give information about what the other player is trying to do, what the player may still have in his or her hand. Why did they give you that card? Was that the worst card that they had, or the best card that they had, but there may be something behind it? They're giving you a certain card because they're setting you up for a trap, because they want you to play it, because then they will steal it from you. It's not true chaos, it's not true randomness. There is a certain meta game going on behind the circulation of the cards on the table, which definitely adds flavor to the game and makes the game interesting. So, the theme is, well, fairly abstract. I wouldn't say, oh, if you like Cyberpunk, you have to get this game, because the game is there, the theme is there and not there. The art is pretty thematic, the art is pretty atmospheric, I like the art, but I don't think that this is the main selling point. A good selling point, at least for me, is that this is a game that is fun to play, that it has a nice pace. Even though there are decisions to make, you do not have any sort of analysis paralysis because your range of options is still fairly limited. But within that range, there is fun stuff to do, there are interesting situations that may arise. This is a very economic game, a very economic design, almost minimalistic, not as minimalistic as Love Letter or Lost Legacy, but you still have the sense of a very terse, a very tight design with some extra options, with some extra things going on when compared to other more minimalistic designs. To me, this is a good filler. I put it in my bag of games, the bag of games that I grab when I go to a game night, and then every every week I change some of the games, I add some, I take some away, but I usually have some 7-8 small games, fillers that stay there, because you never know when the need to play a filler will arise. There is a game night, a group is playing a certain game, and another group is done, and we're waiting for that other group to end their game before we start something else. Then a Cypher, Lost Legacy, the Starship, these are perfect games to play in that situation. And Cypher, even if you want to play a mini campaign, not just a round or two as a filler, but 5, 6, 7 games, and see who the winner is, who can do best in such a single games, there is still enough there to make the game interesting. It may not be the main course of a game night, but it can work anywhere from a filler to something that occupies a fairly good chunk of the game night without boring the players that play the game. People that I played the game with enjoyed it, I personally enjoy it. Cipher to me is a good solid filler with the potential to be a little more than a filler, to be played for enough times in a row to become a, not the protagonist, but a fairly strong co-protagonist of a game night. In any case, a solid game, a lot of fun effects, a lot of fun things that you can do with it. Definitely a game that I would recommend.